Honey Time, a short story. The narrator recalls the life and death of an old beekeeper. Blue florets of borage dangled along the path that wound from the gate to the back door. Worker bees, bloated with pollen, took busy steps up the anthers or drank at the raindrops, resting in the flower's bell. Even in cool weather, there was always a small cloud of bees outside the corner shed, drunk on the smell of honey, their black and gold frames hovering in the air, heavy with industry. The fly-wire door was kept open with a broken brick. Archie was either inside tending to the wood stove and sipping tea, or else in the shed fixing frames or cleaning fume boards with the underside of his capping knife. Most times I was there with my best friend, Dorkel Fazelbad, a chubby Turk, wagging phys ed again and stealing his father's cigarettes. "Hey Archie, you home?" we'd call. He was home. "What are you boys doing?" he'd say, coming out. "No school today?" "It's a curriculum day," said Dorkel, lying, one of the dozens of curriculum days we enjoyed at Archie's place. He never commented on this, and neither did Wayne, his apprentice, who pottered around out the back wearing his grey boiler suit and saying precious little. He was usually working on the truck. Archie owned an old Bedford tray with rusty red fenders, bald tyres and mirrors stained with propolis. It barely made it to 40 miles an hour and was missing second gear. It was essential for transporting hives in the evening. Wayne kept it on the road in spite of every mechanical misgiving. "So how are the bees, Archie?" we'd say. He'd smile and say, "Humming," and then invite us to sit around the stove to hear his tales of yore and reels of bee lore extracted from a book called The ABC of Bee Culture by a character named Amos Root. "Imagine being named Root," I whispered to Dorkel. With a name like Dorkel, I knew he'd understand. Archie wore his khaki shorts, shirt and floppy toweling hat. He wore it all year round. When the weather was really cold, he pulled up his socks and rolled his shirt sleeves down. He was the oldest individual either of us knew, but sprightly and preserved, as he insisted, by a daily dose of royal jelly, which was good for the heart and soothed his rheumatiz. He was tall and gangly and had been supplying honey to the district for more than 50 years. He had never bothered to marry. The lady in his life was Melissa, a cud-chewing house cow brimming with butterfat and a happy disposition. And as well, there were, of course, all the queens of his harem, more hives than we could count. Dorkel told the tale about his uncle Ahmed back in Anatolia, who was a beekeeper and loved his queens more than he loved his wife. "A beekeeper is like a snake charmer," Archie would explain, and told us that in the old days, snake charmers, beekeepers, like elephant boys, bear masters and lion tamers, were always forbidden to marry because they needed a steady heart to match their beast's devotion. "You never thought of marrying then?" I asked, precocious. "Engaged once," he muttered, poking at the fire, but explained that it was the year he imported breeding queens from Serbia, and his loving miss soon left in a jealous pique. The fire was simmering 365 days of the year, and when we arrived he threw on some golden wattle leaves which made the kitchen smoky. This was to clear away some of the drones who would be drinking at his dripping tap or seeking stains of sweetness on his benches. Dorkel in particular was afraid of being stung. "Don't they sting you, Archie?" he would marvel. A bee would land right on Archie's forehead as he talked and trot across his brow without the slightest consternation. "Not for years," he'd say. How come? Because by now his blood was full of pheromones and inhibine and invertase and gluconic acid, and the bees would smell him from a mile away and would descend into a swoon of insect playfulness that was their equivalent to love. They sense fear, you know, he said, and moreover they had a natural hatred of woolly fabrics and hairy men and anyone bow-legged or who might in other ways remind them of a grizzly bear. His tip for junior apiarists was to be as un-bear-like as possible. Bees, he said, could read your inner thoughts. Do this experiment. The next time you are working a hive, start thinking about bears. You'll see, he said. The bees will get all agitated and suspicious, and they'll send out scouts to see what all the bear thinking is about. But as soon as you stop thinking about bears and start thinking about daffodils or roses or bursts of black wattle, the hives will calm down again and the scouts will go back and say, "Don't worry, false alarm." I wanted to give it a try. "Will you let me work some hives with you, Archie?" I asked. I asked it 12 times. For a long while, the best he'd do was take me in his truck to see the hives among the mauve waves of Salvation Jane down the slopes of Woodley Peak, or on another occasion, a longer trip to the ironbark forest across from Bangham Bridges, where there were glorious spreads of pink blossom blended with the sharp nectar of the bloodwood trees. My dad says that beekeepers are freeloaders because they don't own any land and can adjust across the fences, and their bees drain the dams of unsuspecting men, I found the courage to say one time. Archie took an apple out of his lunchbox and bit into its crisp, snowy flesh. "No bees, no apples," he said, formulaic, believing that to be rebuttal enough. He left me in the truck as he went and tended to the hives alone. He seemed to like lone communion, often spending 20 minutes doing nothing, just listening, looking, as far as I could tell. Once, one hot summer's day, at a remote spot out the back of Afghan's Rest, he marched in among tall stacks of white hives armed only with his smoker. He stood and listened as usual. Then, after a while, he made a funny little dance, awkward like a water bird, shifting from leg to leg and spinning about on the spot. And at last he stood frozen, his arms raised up like a rustic ballerina, and the bees all seemed to understand. Wayne was with us that day. Archie marched back to where we were standing and told us that the bees were unhappy with the farmers and the orchardists and didn't like the taste of the river and dreaded the passing years and the shrinking merits of the earth. "Do you know bee language, Archie?" I asked him on the journey home. He didn't answer, but he did explain that his bees at least were Christians, and they liked it when he read the Bible. Since Archie's was a place to escape the tedium of schoolwork, we rarely went there on the weekends. Consequently, we didn't get a chance to catch his customary Sunday sermon. Each Sunday, strapped by orange belts of sun in the dawn, he strode across the dew-soaked paddocks to preach the hives in olden English. He considered it a duty. "Hearken ye bees," he'd begin. "Glory, glory, glory," and then remind them of the parables of Christ and the writings of Timothy and the shipwrecks of Paul, and conclude with a reading from the Psalms. But their favourite, he said, was the book of Ezekiel, especially the bit about the wheels within wheels. One Sunday, I arrived with my father to buy our honey supply, and there was Archie sitting in amongst his home hives, reading portions of a coal-black King James aloud as globs of golden bees amassed on his legs and arms and shoulders, intent on hearing Holy Writ. He shrugged them off, closed the book, and came over to say hello. "Sorry to call on the Sabbath," said my dad, showing an unusual sensitivity. I came around the other day and there was no one home. This was because sometimes Archie and Wayne would be gone for days chasing white clover down at Gnostic Leap, or checking the hives that worked the bimblebox flowering near Restless Pleasure. Other times in autumn, they would drive as far as Thunderfork in pursuit of the rich manuka and fat stores of solar joy before the onset of the winter. Sometimes, on curriculum days, they were away on sojourns into the floral inland, and so Dorkel and I would sit and smoke cigarettes on the back doorstep and talk about the bee lore we'd acquired, such as how competing queens would fly directly at the sun until one fell away, or how the bumblebee was not nearly aerodynamic and how it managed to fly was still a mystery to science. Sometimes Archie would leave out thick aurumic slices of dribbling beeswax, and after 6 or 7 smokes we'd sit chewing on a lump, sucking all the gold from its holes. Even mel-shaped balls of slum gum made us happy. Best of all was honey time, when the essences of the 6-sided sun coagulated into the oozing fluid of spring and made our teeth ache with an overwhelming sweetness. Swarms gathered in the chimney of the old Johnson house. Archie ran his extractor through the night. I asked my father if Archie could take me out to work his hives. He's got a suit and veil that'd fit me, I explained. A few months after turning 12, my father agreed. I suited up and stoked the smoker. I tried to sound professional with chat about foul brood and brace comb and the buckfast hybrid. Archie was unimpressed. Bees are cold-blooded like lizards, he said. That's all you need to know. We drove a few miles down to Gumtree Gully, where he had dozens of hives and was resting in-calf Melissa on a fresh feed of native quongan grass. We walked out to where the hives were buzzing. Then, as I stood at his side, he lifted the lid, and for the very first time I peered into the living hive, gazing at its bustling alchemy, staring at the sexual complexity of it all. Extraordinary skep, secrets of pollen, wriggling gold wonder ordered with some fantastic common mind. I could see into the hidden mysterium of nature then and there. It took my breath away. Businesslike and calm, Archie then started explaining to me that you need a soft bristle brush to gently move the workers from the lid rim, because if you crush too many, the alarm odours start seeping from their abdomens and they can get aggressive. How many is too many? I asked. He preferred not to crush any, but 1 or 2 couldn't really be helped. It was then, at that moment, that I had the horrible realisation that a bee had penetrated through my veil. Archie, Archie, I cried, starting to panic. There's a bee in my veil. Just relax then, he said calmly. The worst that can happen is that you'll get a bite on your face. I tried not to think of bears. It was too much. In an involuntary jerk, I did the worst possible thing. My hand went up to my face, and I suddenly ripped off the veil. The violence of my actions instantly sent ripples of reaction through the open hive, like a black and gold cobra that had just been poked with a stick. An enraged cluster of bees rose up from the hive's belly and was set to strike. Lamely, I glanced at Archie like a fool, trusting his control. He looked back at me helpless. "Run!" he yelled suddenly. "Run, boy! Run!" He ran too. I followed as the bees swooped and started biting at the sweat glands behind my ears. I ran blindly, madly, thrashing with my hands at my head and yelling in genuine terror. It all happened in an instant. Archie kept yelling, "Run!" and we raced across the paddocks towards the water troughs. He dived in first, and I quickly followed. I submerged myself below the dark water and stayed there among the bottom slime as long as I could manage. I came up for a breath and went back under again. Then eventually I noticed that Archie was sitting up and that apparently the swarm of raiders had returned to their hive, having driven off the rude intruders. I surfaced again and this time braced myself against the sides of the trough, long ribbons of thick green algae falling across my sorry face. To my relief, Archie was enormously amused. He let out a yelp of invigoration and laughed a belly laugh, panting. It had been maybe 20 years since he'd tried to outrun a swarm of angry bees. "What the hell did you do that for, boy?" was all he wanted to know. And he underlined the lesson with the rather obvious words, "You never, never, never tear off your veil when you're working a hive, even if there's a bee in your veil and you're likely to get stung." I counted 26 bites on my neck and face. It was 3 days till the swelling went down. 3 or 4 months after this misadventure, I was at home watching television on a quiet, windy afternoon. My father came in and spoke to me and my sister. "Old Archie May has passed away," he reported, matter-of-factly. "Died in his sleep last night." At first I made no reaction. This had nothing to do with being manly or being afraid to show my emotion. More just numbness and the realisation that, yes, he was old Archie May after all. I went for a walk and noticed a few worker bees defying the wind and sucking on the slowly tossing blossoms of the stringy bark that draped across the carport. Later I rang Dorkel, and in the silences we pretended that we weren't sobbing, and we changed the subject to the football after a while. I don't remember why I didn't go to the funeral, but my father and I went to Archie's yard to hear the eulogy to the bees, an ancient custom even mentioned by Amos Root, who reported that it had been adopted by colonial Americans from the ways of rural Europe. How it reached Australia I didn't know. The Queen was from Serbia. Bees have their own traditions, it seems, and tend to them with meticulous ardour. There are no bears in Australia, but the bees don't know that. They keep to their old ways. Wayne was really upset. It took him a long time to pluck his composure. It was the first time that I had seen him wearing anything but his boiler suit. Mrs. Hayworth from down the road comforted him and gave him a pat on the back. He stood up, cleared his throat and looked back at the gathered crowd. He glanced over at me, and when he saw that I was almost crying, he decided to be brave. Solemnly, in deliberate steps, he walked out towards the home hives where Archie kept his breeding queens, the husbandry of a lifetime. He approached the boxes of frames and called out. These were his exact words. "Hear this, ye bees. Archie May is dead and has departed this life for the life eternal. Pray for his soul. May he be guided to an everlasting bliss and be carried up in the rapture that is at the end of time. Amen." And then he read a passage from Ezekiel that began, "And lo, I saw a whirlwind come up from out of the north." The bees stopped and listened. The whole sky stopped and listened. The drones went and gave the bad news to the Queen. She wept gossamer tears, bathed herself in dextrose, took comfort in her young, and declared a season of mourning by royal decree. Wayne walked back and we all went home, more or less in silence. The next day, Dorkel and me wagged Phys Ed again and went down to the rocks near Gumtree Gully where Melissa and her newborn calf were grazing in the tepid light. We chain-smoked until we felt green and feverish, but otherwise had nothing to say. I stood up and balanced on a fallen tree branch that made a sort of bridge across the gully. Do they eulogy the bees in Turkey? I wanted to know. Of course, he said. Of course. But he explained that in Turkey they had Muslim bees and that they would read out a portion of the Holy Quran. That made sense. Okay, I said. And we walked up the gully towards the pine plantation to look for mushrooms after the recent rain.